Hello. In this episode of Heirs for Architecture, the writer Rob Fiehn speaks about London of the Future, an anthology of essays with pictures produced by the London Society and published by Merrill, by some of the capital's leading visionaries from a wide array of disciplines who give voice to imaginaries of the possibly imminent. Rob is director of the London Society and chair of the Museum of Architecture.
Heirs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Heirs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Rob Fiehn. Rob, would you introduce yourself?
Thanks very much. Yes, my name is Rob Fiehn. I'm the director of the London Society.
And that's it. That's fantastically tight. I think there's more to you than this. But yeah, how do you get to be the head of the London Society? And what is, I suppose, the London Society?
I suppose I've been working in the architectural sector for a couple of decades, mostly working within book publishing, PR, communication, and event organising, which is great because it gives you a fantastic overview of the whole industry, which a lot of people aren't always afforded when they're working on their projects within their sector, which is great. And I think I started to give a lot of my time up for volunteer work. So I'm also the chair of the Museum of Architecture, which is a small charity that runs events like the Gingerbread City. And I was a committee member of the London Society, and when this job came up, I thought it would be great to have a more direct role in the running of the society, which is fantastic. So I'm quite new in post, but while as a committee member, I was working on London of the Future, which is the book that we've just produced. The society itself was set up in 1912 by various luminaries of the time, like Aston Webb and Edwin Lutyens, and lots of their mates. And they wanted to get together and find ways to improve the city that they love so much. So they were very much interested in engaging with the public, because they felt that people needed to understand how everything worked. And so they would run competitions to design new bridges, and they would run campaigns to build awareness about ways to better plan London. And I think this was very much at the time where there was a big civic revolution going on with the planning of London, rather than the sort of Victorian laissez-faire attitude of people doing bits and pieces here and there. So it was a really exciting time for them, and we've trying to continue that into the 21st century, really. So we run lots of events, tours, talks, campaigns, and generally just trying to become that bridge between the profession and the public.
Oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting point. Maybe we can come back to that, this idea of being a bridge. But you trained in architecture or trained in literature, or so, an area like that?
So by training, I guess I could be described as an art historian.
Okay.
But during my degree, I got much more interested in architecture than art. And which led me down some very strange routes in terms of dissertations and coursework.
Mm-hmm. So the London Society gets founded just before the First World War. And then obviously everything changes because loads of people get killed for no good reason. And then you get this London of the Future. So we're talking about your book, which you published, well, the London Society's book, London of the Future, which was published this year by Merrill. And it's a gorgeous book, hardback, and what do they describe it? Lavishly illustrated, I think is that's the go-to adjective for any illustration. Has to be either lavish or black and white. But it's lavishly illustrated. And it's 100 years directly after the publication of the previous London of the Future, which so I thought perhaps before we talk about your book, perhaps it would be good to talk about its forebear, its antecedent, the original London of the Future, because it's the starting point, I suppose. It's the point at which your writers in this anthology bounce off. Is that right? Or
In a way, yes. I mean, so we're a little bit, due to COVID and various other reasons, we're a little bit behind schedule. So our new book comes out 102 years
Oh,
after the original,
how unfortunate.
which was annoying. But I guess once we realized that we weren't going to make our self-imposed deadline, did free us up to spend a bit more time on the planning of it.
Yeah.
But no, we took great inspiration from the original book, because essentially the writers were given free rein pretty much to come up with whatever they wanted to suggest in terms of improvements. And also it was very eclectic. And I think that's really important, that they weren't trying to create a sort of unified narrative. They were sort of saying, here's 15 to 18 ideas of how to improve London, and they could all be taken individually. And so you could, rather than saying to any government, you have to do all of these things, they were sort of saying, here are informed people suggesting loads of different ideas, any one of which, if you were to take them up, would be great for London.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's what we didn't give our authors for the new book too much of a brief. They were sort of selected for their areas of expertise, but could take it off in any direction that they wanted to, and they didn't know what anyone else was writing. Some of them were told of a few of the other contributors, but really they did it in isolation.
Excellent. And you found that there was still I was reading around the London of the Future before. I just explain. I was reading around the first London of the Future, and there was a couple of academic papers that I came across, which talked about it. One of them, particularly good one, I thought, written in 2012, was talking about that London of the future being really a programmatic for modernity, for this idea of London as a modern city, but a city that was in need of modernization, that needed to become coherent urbanistically, architecturally. It needed to become more like the center of a proper empire, which, you'd have thought, sort of like, given London, that seems reasonable, and so on and so forth. So it had a kind of coherent narrative thread running through it about modernity. But I was reading your recent one, the London of the Future 2023, and I was trying to work out what is the coherent thread here. And was it something that you kind of, when you approached these authors, you were like, maybe think about this, maybe like this is the idea, this is the direction, or did you select your authors with a kind of idea about a certain dynamic or trajectory?
I think that the first book was interesting because the London Society was also simultaneously very concerned with keeping the best of the past.
Mm.
So they did for many years, in the latter half of the 20th century. I think they had a real reputation as more of a sort of 20th century society. This idea they were trying to just conserve things, which was all completely against their founding principles. As you say, they were keen on a modern London, but they were also desperately keen to make sure that we didn't lose that sense of our own history and identity. So they were always trying to sort of marry those two things. And Aston Webb gave an after-dinner speech a few years after the first book came out, where he talks about a dream that he had. Obviously, it's very well suited for his speech. He talks about a dream where he sort of flies around London 100 years later. Actually, it was in the year 2014. He flies around London, and the city is incredibly clean. And he spots all his favorite landmarks, and then he sees some newer buildings which are quite, intriguing to him. But the idea is, gone is the sort of soot and the dirt and the dust and the poverty and the inequality. So I definitely think they had that vision of a sort of cleaner, safer, better, well-planned London. I would say for our book, we selected progressive writers, if I'm honest. And we, as you'll see, we did target people that do know about conservation, as well as targeting people who know about housing and development and kind of climate friendly strategies. So I think we knew that they would all be broadly in favour of of a sort of sensible progressive way forward. However, some of them did come back to me and said, "Does this have to be a utopian or a dystopian vision?" And I said, "Look, it's up to you." And so some of them are not very happy endings for London, and they act more as a warning, I think, for what will happen if we continue down, some of the current paths that we're on, which I think is really interesting because I believe that if you dress up everything as, a sort of happy, clappy, this is how we're going to make London brilliant, I think you lose some of that urgency.
Yeah. This, I suppose, for me, a critical question. I live outside London, but I rarely go in anymore. Is that London isn't really one thing. It's very difficult to define it. So I asked a colleague of mine who lives in London. He travels down to teach, where I teach. I said to him, "What? This was just this morning." I said, what is the future of London?" And he looked at me and he said, "Well, what is London?" And I thought this is an important question. Like, how are we defining London in London of the future? Are we including the home counties? Are we sticking within the M25? Are we talking about that little central bit where combination of city workers, tourists, and GPs/architects live? Or are we talking about, and also obviously their service staff, or are we talking about the whole of this, what is it, 7 to 9 million strong city?
I think we are talking we managed to talk in the book in terms of the sort of broader geographical reach and some hyper localism. Mm-hmm. So we are talking. So I think London is both, isn't it? It's both your immediate area, and then it's also this much broader, sometimes sprawling mass. So at least two of the authors are very keen on local food production, and are convinced that we will have to harness any arable land outside of the confines of the capital, and that the idea that we have all this farmland which would have once fed London and now it doesn't. So there's definitely talk about the very edges of London and how it interacts with its surrounding areas. There's also obviously an entire chapter dedicated to just the City of London. And I do think, historically and financially, it is the sort of beating heart of the capital. And so it seemed crazy to us that we wouldn't explore that. And what's interesting about that chapter is that the author gives us three potential kind of fanciful. This is Kat Hannah. Kat Hannah focuses on the City of London, and she gives us three sort of hypothetical scenarios of what could happen to the city were it to drop its sort of financial centre status. What would it become? And I think that's a really interesting, although they are slightly tongue-in-cheek. I think what she's suggesting is that nothing is set in stone, and that London could be anything could become anything while remaining London, if that makes sense. And then the other sort of more expansive side of things, which I should mention, is Tony Travers, who talks about this sort of London as this sort of encroaching monster onto the southeast. And this idea that London could grow and could expand and could hoover up more areas, but not necessarily through lines drawn on map, but through economic partnerships and trade and investment.
It's an interesting issue, isn't it? This idea of London eating it up. I think that's your phrase, not mine. And you've mentioned the ideas of sustainability. I mean, speaking to some people who live in southwest London, they live in, I don't know, Dulwich or somewhere out there. To all intents and purposes, they don't really live in London at all. They never go into London to the core. They live in a bit of London. it's punishingly expensive for everybody due to processes of gentrification and hypergentrification. It doesn't really have a future, does it? I mean, like, who's going to live? Who's going to live there when you're paying 17 and nothing being done is addressing that? I mean, you've mentioned conservation as well. I mean, there's no aspect since London's got its own mayor under Ken Livingstone and then under Boris and now under Sadiq Khan. None of them have sought to conserve anything. I mean, look at what they're doing to Battersea or Nine Elms. Look at what they've done to the City of London. Look at what they're doing to London Bridge. Look at what Canary Wharf is still going strong. It's Croydon, which isn't even London, but sort of is London, now looks like Canary Wharf did. So like what, I don't really understand this notion of, I suppose some of the progressive agendas that are expressed within the book don't really seem to meet with the reality as we perceive it from the outside, which is a city that's completely out of control and it's sort of politically lacking in empathy, doesn't seem to be addressing distinct inequalities, doesn't seem to be addressing anything at a kind of structural level. So like, how does it? Yeah, so I'm kind of confused a little bit, I suppose. As an outsider, like, what is this thing that you're trying to protect? Like, should it be? Can it be? It's not so much can it be, but should it be even protected? Should it be preserved for the future?
But I do think that Anna Minton's essay goes some way to talk about what you're describing. She does see a London out of control and run by capital more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And she doesn't really see a solution, unless there's going to be kind of wholesale political change and also a big shift in public opinion on how they interact with the built environment and sort of not putting up with, as you say, that systemic inequality.
Yeah,
I think also this idea that that London sort of, I guess we believe that London does have some good points, and that maybe what I think is really interesting is that each chapter, no matter who has written it, they have to talk about the past to then talk about the future. So we never told everyone that. We never said you have to do a historical analysis before you get started. But I think they all felt it was incumbent to show to the reader that they understand the context with which they're describing. So I think what that shows is that we can take the best of London's past and we can transpose it to the future. And I think what's great about Mark Brearley's essay on the high streets is that he says these local economies are what made London great. It's what meant that people could live and work within their local area. And you're right, they didn't have to go into the core because they had everything they needed within their area. And so this idea of actually, could we have a broader vision to support that and create an entire city of high streets where there is some local manufacturing, where there is retail, where there is community amenities? I think he totally gets that. So I think you're right in the sense that potentially you could see London as totally out of control, but also it has the seeds within it for its own survival. Yeah. And I guess maybe we should acknowledge that we're at a tipping point where if we undermine any more of those things that made London so good, we may never get them back.
Yeah, for sure. I thought maybe we could talk about some of the themes. I mean, I picked out in my own reading of it, I picked out some themes. I mean, big, broad themes. You've already touched on the issue around food, which I think is really fascinating one. And I recorded a podcast a short while back about what are called CPULs, continuous productive urban landscapes. And there was a proposal by some academics from Brighton for generating these great seas of productive landscapes through London, and it's a kind of exercise in imagination. which I think fits very well with your book, by the way, which is like the first one, described as an exercise in the contemporary urban imagination. I think that goes well with your book as well. It's a speculation rooted, as you said, in history and rooted in the processes that generate London. But I thought perhaps we could talk about this issue around democracy, which I think is possibly, if London falls, and that sounds like a dreadful Gerard Butler film, it will be because of a lack of democracy precipitating a level of civil unrest which makes it unsustainable. How does Sarah Ichioka talk about this? What are the general ideas? Because Indy Johar in his article is ultimately talking about democracy as well, and Carolyn Steele in the one on food is ultimately talking about it as well. What does this look like? What does a democratic London of the future look like?
Well, I think, and also Baroness Lawrence is very, she mixes up justice and governance, and I think that they're all mainly calling for greater participation, and that does seem to be quite decentralized in the sense that it seems to be there is. I mean, I would agree with this, that there seems to be more happening at a local level in London that is quite not revolutionary, but certainly taking steps in the right direction in certain boroughs. And I think the average person does feel more empowered to engage with that. I think as soon as you start getting to citywide politics, people switch off. I think when you get to national politics, they sort of worse than switch off. They sort of get angry, but sort of with no direction to point that towards. So I do think that the hyperlocal is potentially the way out for London, because that this, I think Johar talks about these sort of citizens. I can't remember what he calls them, but sort of gatherings and formal structures, and then them feeding back to people to hopefully implement their ideas and plans. And I think those partnerships between local governance and people could make a huge difference, because people do often know what they need to support their own communities. And I think you're right. I don't think they would opt for the out of control gentrification and hyper regeneration. That they're not always keen on that. And you do see instances where projects are rejected by local councils because they're shocked, even by going through a pre-planning application process. No one seems to be aware of quite what everyone was suggesting. And so
you've got that fantastic example in the news at the moment of Greenwich Council trying to get that abominable building knocked down so that they build the abominable building that they said they were going to build, rather than the really bad one that they did build.
And I have to say, I mean, I'm really pleased that Greenwich Council is taking a stand on that issue. I think the demolition itself seems extreme and slightly wasteful, but it is as you say, it is an abomination. But there are other questions that people are raising, where they say one of the discrepancies from the planning was that there was supposed to be an underground car park freeing up the ground level for a playground. But they clearly never dug that underground car park and the initial works. So what is the oversight from the local authority there? And I'm sure the developer is going to take this to the courts. There's no way they're just going to demolish a building straight away. So I think you have to ask yourself, I think local government does have to take some responsibility in these things. 26 deviations from the planning application, and nobody thought, people just waited until the whole thing was built and fully occupied before saying, oh, actually we're not that happy.
But I mean, it does just come across as like a Wild West situation. I was talking to an architect a few years ago about what it was like in the London Docklands during a period of deregulation there, when they got Canary Wharf and and that vast area of across the east of London, north and south of the River Dun. And he said it was just like no one was watching. Like you just went out there, you drank a lot, and you had meetings with people, and they would be like, build something on that. And that was basically a brief. And I think that that must be still part of the culture where they go, oh, you said you're going to build that. And then they just don't turn up till practical completion. And it's kind of mad. And obviously, the more terrifying London example is Grenfell, where there was, again, quite clearly a total lack of accountability at that kind of domestic level of the production of the built environment.
And I think, again, to talk back to our point about people understanding their local areas, or even in the case of Grenfell, their own building, what was heartbreaking was that the residents group did write to the council on multiple times outlining that their building was a death trap. So they knew the dangers of their own structure.
Can you imagine?
And yet no one decided to take any action on that. And I think it you know, what we can take from Grenfell is that we can't rely on the governing bodies to always be on the case.
Yeah, so it comes back to your point about this kind of hyper localized and district based idea, which is obviously the feedback loops between democratically elected bodies like local, borough councils and the people that aren't working. So something new needs to be done. And it's kind of an exciting idea that London, for all its scale, is about the right kind of scale to be able to try and explore this. Because smaller than that, you're already kind of represented through parish councils and potentially through, PTAs in schools. There is a kind of a quite reciprocal, dynamic and agile democratic feedback loop. But in the city, you've got the GLA, you've got your borough councils, and then I guess if they don't pick it up, who's paying attention, as you found?
Yeah, and I think that London has always historically been a collection of villages, as you say, sort of tied together by these loose boundaries. I mean, I now live in the northeast of London, but where I am was Essex until the 1960s. So, it's just funny how the line changes, the postcode alters, but the people didn't change overnight. The landscape certainly hasn't. There's lots of, Epping Forest is protected and you can't build upon it. So it is just interesting, as you said, about this idea of what actually constitutes London.
So this is a really interesting point. So why do you think, living all that way, what is it? What is Londonness? It sounds like a stupid question, but how can somebody who lives in the suburbs, I have family that live down in kind of, what do they call it? South Norwood, because they don't want to call it Penge, because Penge sounds like something you do to yourself when you overstretch. What is it to be? But they call themselves London. They see themselves as being part of this thing that is London. And obviously, it's like an actual geographical line. You can look at it on a map. Do I live within it or do I live without it? But there's a sensibility to being a Londoner, isn't there? There's a kind of a mental architecture that comes with the name. Like, I am a Londoner. I mean, what does that mean for you, Rob?
I mean, I like to draw back on bizarrely on some of the Terry Pratchett novels that I read when I was a kid, and he invented this city Ankh-Morpork, which was clearly, I thought, an analogy for London. And what was great about his city was that it was very syncretic. That basically it would always the point was the city was never invaded because they would always open their doors to the invaders and say, "Well, we've just come on in and just become part of us." And I do think there's an element of that in London. That I was born and bred in this city, but I have met many other people who've only been here for a couple of years, and I feel that we're kind of equally Londoners. I don't feel that I have a sort of an ownership to London, and I think it does something to you when you're in the confines. I do think it helps when you do move around a bit. And so I have to I do sometimes take my friends to key. Maybe that's the part of the London society in me. But I do take my friends to, sites of interest which they might not know about, and I do make them sometimes journey into the dreaded centre. But I think you do become aware of the differences and the similarities as you move around
Mm-hmm.
the city. And there, I live in the northeast. I grew up in Putney in the southwest, and there are definitely there's so many things that I feel are similar actually, even though I'm now diametrically opposed across the geography. So yeah, I think there is some sense of civic pride, although obviously loads of people might debate that with me, and
Mm-hmm.
I'd be happy to have that debate. Whereas maybe some people feel that being in London is doing them a disservice. But I guess then you would have to ask yourself, if you stopped loving London, maybe what is the point of living here? Because as you said, everything is more expensive:
Mm-hmm.
goods, services, rent. So I think you have to see some benefit, and
Yeah.
maybe that's proximity to work, or maybe it's your surrounding community. There's lots of people in my local area now who were born and raised here, so they've got all their parents and grandparents around them.
I occasionally go to the American Embassy. So there's the only two places I ever go in London. There's the American Embassy, which used to be really cool Eero Saarinen building in the West End, and now it's a massive castle in the centre of London with a moat and men with machine guns. And all of the descriptions in the book are dependent upon a reality which maybe isn't true, that London isn't the master of its own fate. And all of the decisions about its democratic form, its urban development, its economic use, even its cultural production, are actually dependent upon the occupying force, which is America. I mean, literally, they've built a castle with a moat, depending on what they want. So London is, as you've pointed out at the beginning, like London is the city. And it has this big donut of service around it. And then the city is America. It's capitalism. It's neoliberal capitalism. It's globalization. It's world city things. It's all of this. So all of these visions are very, very poetic and they're very creative. But isn't it possibly the case that, in fact, just as London used to be the center of the British Empire, which is why it's so rich, because it went around the world nicking people's money. Now it's the center of the second center to the American Empire, which we're their Western European outpost. So I just wonder whether, like, I wonder whether London actually has the agency that people like to think it has, or whether it's rather, yeah, an outpost now.
I think, interestingly, as the UK diminishes internationally, I do feel that there is a glimmer of hope that London is still considered, a global player in terms of the great cities of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it's wonderful that city leaders can meet and talk about their dreams and hopes and aspirations, and also compete with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Paris is making these fantastic moves in terms of pedestrianization and regreening the city and making more of their river. And I do feel that when things like that happen, I feel that London sort of feels the need to speed up its own initiatives and to take part in this sort of great race of the cities of the world. So I do think there's some agency there. I think I love the fact that we are definitely making small steps towards a sort of pedestrianised Oxford Street. I think that's going to become, much higher on the agenda in the coming, I'd say in the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have a real, if not an implemented plan, certainly, a start. And, Westminster Council has already sort of started to say like those horrible sweet shops or those empty retail outlets are going to be given over for free to smaller independent businesses to have for 6 months to build up their own business. And I think we will start to see a more livable, more walkable centre, which is less car dominated. And I know that that process is going to be uncomfortable and sticky, but I think it wouldn't be possible without some civic vision for London. And I think what I guess I think what businesses have realised, and they're pushing back to local government, is to say that we need the centre to be attractive. We need people to, as you were saying, to want to come in and experience the best of London. And so whether that's improved cultural institutions, and whether that's more pleasant areas to walk and rest in. I mean, I think King's Cross Granary Square is really interesting model because it's all very developer led, which, as we know, doesn't always generate the best urban examples. But they've got this amazing square, which is just a draw because it's a square with some fountains and there's places for people to sit and there's a canal with some steps. And it kind of feels like it really is a case of sort of build it and they will come. So I think you are seeing these improvements coming. It's just sometimes it's happening slowly and piecemeal.
I suppose that comes back to the differences between the initial London of the future and the recent and your one, let's call it that for shorthand, where you have obviously that one is to do with modernization. Modernization is a very comprehensive idea. It's a very colonialist idea to all intents and purposes. I know people would contest that, but I think the two things seem to walk in lockstep fairly evidently. Where there's this idea that London, for example, London needs to be made more coherent as a city. This is a kind of top-down application of a design logic, a spatial logic, an urban logic to a messy, laissez-faire capitalist city. Now we've got this idea in your book, and the whole character of the book as this kind of polyphony of different arguments and voices is something to do with plurality or pluralism. London of the future is a London of plurality, which means that, well, for me, it felt like some of these bigger visions, particularly around ecology and the environment, which are kind of impositional in their demands. Really, it's a real struggle between these two things. Like, how does London retain its granular, how does it pursue a granular, localized, democratic, urban development strategy, for example, and at the same time enact wide-ranging eco strategies that are going to ameliorate for climate change? Like, it's a real problem at the scale of London, because you're dealing with, like, either you believe in radical democracy and the chance that some community in Brixton says, actually, we just want loads of cars and we want 3 petrol stations and a dual carriageway. Or you've got someone telling you how to, I don't know, urban green the back lanes.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference, which I should have mentioned earlier, about the two books. And the first book does propose large capital projects, like, building airports in parks.
Yeah, that was the best. That's the best idea I've yet heard.
Yeah,
in central London, in Hyde Park.
Yeah, and just building them on top of them and sort of having the park underneath, which is quite wild. But they do believe in these huge sort of capital projects and ideas, and obviously therefore investment. I think what's interesting is, without any briefing, all of our authors have pretty much said we need to take what we've got and find ways to adapt it. So whether that is, Sarah saying, come on, we could easily plant more trees, use natural devices for water runoff we can, so we can absorb carbon while providing shade, while also dealing with, mitigating flooding. So she's clearly talking about that, but she's talking about it within the existing fabric. She's not saying, at no point does she say, tear down the House of Parliament and plant a forest, which is kind of maybe what London in the Future, 1.0 would have suggested. And also at sort of more micro scale, people talking about retrofitting existing housing so that it's more energy efficient and more capable to deal with the climate crisis. So that's building per building. And I think all of this comes back to the society's vision of engaging better with people. So as you say, what's to stop the people of Brixton building 5 petrol stations and a multi-lane highway? I think what's to stop them is full, proper discussion, public engagement, bringing in many voices and then talking about the benefits of different ideas and proposals. And often when you do talk to people and you say, well, would you like a car park or a park? I think a lot of them do opt for the park option. And that, I think what we're seeing with motorists at the moment is we're seeing some very loud and impassioned voices, but I don't think they necessarily speak for the majority. I think it's a group of people who believe very strongly in their way of life, which is fine. And then guess I would also argue that if the people in this Brixton neighbourhood wanted to build 5 petrol stations, maybe at some point that's the democratic decision that happens. So I think I think what we're talking about is simultaneously someone taking charge of larger issues while trying to implement them with local buy-in. And I think you can only do that by talking about it. And I think that's why we wanted to revisit the book, because it has opened up a lot of doors to discussion. And I think the original book, I think it was shown to MPs and various people of note. I think Aston Webb was walking around waving it in front of people's noses saying, this is how to build a better London.
Have you been doing so as well?
Well, the London Society runs an all-party parliamentary group on the built environment. So we haven't sort of taken them to task on this yet, because in the previous 2 years, we were doing a project on the suburbs. But I think this is going to be our next big issue. So we will use we're a small charity, but we'll use any clout or influence we can to try and impress this upon people.
A last question. The Houses of Parliament's rebuild cost is now projected to reach £22 billion, which is not even going to scratch the surface. Which included, the first budget, by the way, which was only £5.5 billion, included £100 million for wire. I would have done the wiring for cheaper than that on my own, and probably quicker. Anyway, and I don't even know how to do wiring. It doesn't seem sustainable. That is not sustainable. That's an absurdity. Wouldn't it be better? So 2 questions. Wouldn't it be better to build a new one somewhere else? And does London retain its identity without government? Is London the centre of governance? If we move the centre of government to, say, Birmingham, which would make a lot of sense, there's plenty of examples in cities like America where you have an administrative centre, but you have cultural centres that are bigger and more dynamic, like New York and Los Angeles versus Washington, D.C. Could we still have London as is without the Houses of Parliament and Whitehall?
I think London is more than government, and I think if you imagine the tourists coming to London, they love the look of the Houses of Parliament, but they probably don't care what actually happened, the processes that go on inside very much. And as you say, I've been to some fantastic cities which have some fantastic civic buildings, but they aren't key to the running of that country. So I think London is more than its governing role. And I think also giving Parliament to another city could be really good for the UK and could free up London to do more of the things it wants to do, focused on itself and not worrying about its necessarily about its relationship with controlling the whole country. So I'm not worried about that at all. One of the ideas posited in London of the Future, our book, is that the House of Parliament is sold to an Asian hotelier, and just retrofitted with lots of rooms for luxury visitors to the capital. And I think she proposes moving Parliament to the Bloomberg building. So I think there's two answers to your question. I think one, we could move Parliament to Birmingham and to make a more equitable country, or I think we could retrofit another building it already exists in London for Parliament. And I do think the costs for the existing building are astronomical. And I'm also aware that the reason the plans for improving the building have been delayed is that incoming MPs want to have their few years in the actual House of Parliament. So they're all doing it for very selfish reasons.
MPs being selfish. Who would have thought?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's a wonderful book and really, really interesting. I guess there is one other question. What does London teach us? How can we leverage London? So how does the work of the London Society in this London of the future, how can we utilize this for generating new thinking around our capital, but also just world cities in general? Like, is London a model that we can copy? And is this book, London of the Future, does it express a blueprint for ways of thinking about cities of the future?
I think the book expresses it. I think London's past, as I said, has some great nuggets for a sort of polycentric city, and the way that a well-connected city which has multiple centres, I think is a great international model, rather than the sort of Parisian kind of rings of inequality. Yeah. I would argue that yes, there are chapters like Mark Stevenson's London's New Nickname. I think show a really interesting way that a city could lead the world. I think we've got a bit of a longer way to go to get there.
Yes, thank you very much, Rob. That was really wonderful.
Thank you. No, thank you for having me.
So that's London. So good they named it once. Thanks to Rob for the conversation, and to Merrill and the London Society for the book. Links to it and to Rob's various online professional persona are in the podcast description. Thanks for listening.